Chapter 3 of G.K. Chesterton's Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. G.K. Chesterton's Charles Dickens. Chapter 3. The Youth of Dickens. There are popular phrases so picturesque that even when they are intentionally funny, they are unintentionally poetical. I remember, to take one instance out of many, hearing a heated secularist in Hyde Park apply to some parson or other the exquisite expression, a sky pilot. Subsequent inquiry has taught me that the term is intended to be comic and even contemptuous, but in the first freshness of it I went home repeating it to myself like a new poem. Few of the pious legends have conceived so strange and yet celestial a picture as this of a pilot in the sky, leaning on his helm above the empty heavens, and carrying his cargo of souls higher than the loneliest cloud. The phrase is like a lyric of Shelley. Or, to take another instance from another language, the French have an incomparable idiom for a boy playing truant. Il fait l'école buissonnière. He goes to the bushy school, or the school among the bushes. How admirably this accidental expression, the bushy school, not to be lightly confounded with the art school at Bushey, how admirably this bushy school expresses half the modern notions of a more natural education. The two words express the whole poetry of Wordsworth, the whole philosophy of Thoreau, and are quite as good literature as either. Now, among a million of such scraps of inspired slang there is one which describes a certain side of Dickens better than pages of explanation. The phrase, appropriately enough, occurs at least once in his works, and that on a fitting occasion. When Job Trotter is sent by Sam on a wild chase after Mr. Perker, the solicitor, Mr. Perker's clerk condoles with Job upon the lateness of the hour, and the fact that all habitable places are shut up. "My friend," said Mr. Perker's clerk, "you've got the key of the street." Mr. Perker's clerk, who was a flippant and scornful young man, may perhaps be pardoned if he used this expression in a flippant and scornful sense. But let us hope that Dickens did not. Let us hope that Dickens saw the strange yet satisfying imaginative justice of the words. For Dickens himself had, in the most sacred and serious sense of the term, the key of the street. When we shut out anything, we are shut out of that thing. When we shut out the street, we are shut out of the street. Few of us understand the street, even when we step into it, as into a house or room of strangers. Few of us see through the shining riddle of the street, the strange folk that belong to the street only, the street walker or the street Arab, the nomads who, generation after generation, have kept their ancient secrets in the full blaze of the sun. Of the street at night many of us know even less. The street at night is a great house locked up. But Dickens had, if ever man had, the key of the street. His stars were the lamps of the street. His hero was the man in the street. He could open the inmost door of his house, the door that leads into that secret passage which is lined with houses and roofed with stars. This silent transformation into a citizen of the street took place during those dark days of boyhood, when Dickens was drudging at the factory. Whenever he had done drudging he had no other resource but drifting, and he drifted over half London. He was a dreamy child, thinking mostly of his own dreary prospects. Yet he saw and remembered much of the streets and squares he passed. Indeed, as a matter of fact, he went the right way to work unconsciously to do so. He did not go in for observation, a priggish habit. He did not look at Charing Cross to improve his mind, or count the lamp-posts in Holborn to practise his arithmetic. But unconsciously he made all these places the scenes of the monstrous drama in his miserable little soul. He walked in darkness under the lamps of Holborn, and was crucified at Charing Cross. So for him ever afterwards these places had the beauty that only belongs to battlefields. For our memory never fixes the facts which we have merely observed. The only way to remember a place for ever is to live in the place for an hour, and the only way to live in the place for an hour is to forget the place for an hour. The undying scenes we can all see if we shut our eyes are not the scenes that we have stared at under the direction of guide-books. The scenes we see are the scenes at which we did not look at all, the scenes in which we walked when we were thinking about something else, about a sin, or a love affair, or some childish sorrow. We can see the background now because we did not see it then. So Dickens did not stamp these places on his mind, he stamped his mind on these places. For him, ever afterwards, these streets were mortally romantic. They were dipped in the purple dyes of youth and its tragedy, and rich with irrevocable sunsets. Herein is the whole secret of that eerie realism with which Dickens could always vitalize some dark or dull corner of London. There are details in the Dickens descriptions, a window or a railing or the keyhole of a door, which he endows with demoniac life. The things seem more actual than things really are. Indeed, that degree of realism does not exist in reality. It is the unbearable realism of a dream. And this kind of realism can only be gained by walking dreamily in a place. It cannot be gained by walking observantly. Dickens himself has given a perfect instance of how these nightmare minutiae grew upon him in his trance of abstraction. He mentions, among the coffee shops into which he crept in those wretched days, one in St. Martin's Lane, "of which I only recollect it stood near the church, and that in the door there was an oval glass plate with Coffee Room painted on it, addressed towards the street. If I ever find myself in a very different kind of coffee room now, but where there is an inscription on glass, and read it backwards on the wrong side, Moor Efoc, as I often used to do then in a dismal reverie, a shock goes through my blood." That wild word, Moor Efoc, is the motto of all effective realism. It is the masterpiece of the good realistic principle, the principle that the most fantastic thing of all is often the precise fact. And that elfish kind of realism Dickens adopted everywhere. His world was alive with inanimate object. The date on the door danced over Mr. Grewgious's. The knocker grinned at Mr. Scrooge. The Roman on the ceiling pointed down at Mr. Tulkinghorn. The elderly armchair leered at Tom Smart. These are all Moor Efoc-ish things. A man sees them because he does not look at them. And so the little Dickens Dickensized London. He prepared the way for all his personages. Into whatever cranny of our city his characters might crawl, Dickens had been there before them. However wild were the events he narrated as outside him, they could not be wilder than the things that had gone on within. However queer a character of Dickens might be, he could hardly be queerer than Dickens was. The whole secret of his after writings is sealed up in those silent years of which no written word remains. Those years did him harm perhaps, as his biographer Forster has thoughtfully suggested, by sharpening a certain fierce individualism in him, which once or twice during his genial life flashed like a half-hidden knife. He was always generous, but things had gone too hardly with him for him to be always easy-going. He was always kind-hearted. He was not always good-humoured. Those years may also, in their strange mixture of morbidity and reality, have increased in him his tendency to exaggeration. But we can scarcely lament this in a literary sense. Exaggeration is almost the definition of art, and it is entirely the definition of Dickens's art. Those years may have given him many moral and mental wounds, from which he never recovered, but they gave him the key of the street. There is a weird contradiction in the soul of the born optimist. He can be happy and unhappy at the same time. With Dickens, the practical depression of his life at this time did nothing to prevent him from laying up those hilarious memories of which all his books are made. No doubt he was genuinely unhappy in the poor place where his mother kept school. Nevertheless, it was there that he noticed the unfathomable quaintness of the little servant whom he made into the Marchioness. No doubt he was comfortless enough at the boarding-house of Mrs. Roylance, but he perceived with a dreadful joy that Mrs. Roylance's name was Pipchin. There seems to be no incompatibility between taking in tragedy and giving out comedy. They are able to run parallel in the same personality. One incident which he described in his unfinished autobiography, and which he afterwards transferred almost verbatim to David Copperfield, was peculiarly rich and impressive. It was the inauguration of a petition to the King for a bounty, drawn up by a committee of the prisoners in the Marshalsea, a committee of which Dickens's father was the president, no doubt in virtue of his oratory, and also the scribe, no doubt in virtue of his genuine love of literary flights. "As many of the principal officers of this body as could be got into a small room without filling it up, supported him in front of the petition, and my old friend, Captain Porter, who had washed himself to do honour to so solemn an occasion, stationed himself close to it, to read it to all who were unacquainted with its contents. The door was then thrown open, and they began to come in a long file, several waiting on the landing outside, while one entered, affixed his signature, and went out. To everybody in succession Captain Porter said, 'Would you like to hear it read?' If he weakly showed the least disposition to hear it, Captain Porter in a loud sonorous voice gave him every word of it. I remember a certain luscious roll he gave to such words as 'Majesty, Gracious Majesty, Your Gracious Majesty's unfortunate subjects, Your Majesty's well-known munificence,' as if the words were something real in his mouth and delicious to taste. My poor father, meanwhile, listening with a little of an author's vanity, and contemplating, not severely, the spike on the opposite wall. Whatever was comical or pathetic in this scene, I sincerely believe I perceived in my corner, whether I demonstrated it or not, quite as well as I should perceive it now. I made out my own little character and story for every man who put his name to the sheet of paper." Here we see very plainly that Dickens did not merely look back in after days and see that these humours had been delightful. He was delighted at the same moment that he was desperate. The two opposite things existed in him simultaneously, and each in its full strength. His soul was not a mixed colour like grey and purple, caused by no component colour being quite itself. His soul was like a shot silk of black and crimson, a shot silk of misery and joy. Seen from the outside, his little pleasures and extravagances seem more pathetic than his grief. Once the solemn little figure went into a public-house in Parliament Street, and addressed the man behind the bar in the following terms: "What is your very best, the very best ale a glass?" The man replied, "Twopence." "Then," said the infant, "just draw me a glass of that, if you please, with a good head to it." The landlord, says Dickens, in telling the story, looked at me in return over the bar, from head to foot, with a strange smile on his face, and, instead of drawing the beer, looked round the screen and said something to his wife, who came out from behind it, with her work in her hand, and joined him in surveying me. They asked me a good many questions as to what my name was, how old I was, where I lived, how I was employed, etc., etc., to all of which, that I might commit nobody, I invented appropriate answers. They served me with the ale, though I suspect it was not the strongest on the premises, and the landlord's wife, opening the little half-door, and bending down, gave me a kiss." Here he touches that other side of common life which he was chiefly to champion. He was to show that there is no ale like the ale of a poor man's festival, and no pleasures like the pleasures of the poor. At other places of refreshment he was yet more majestic. "I remember," he says, "tucking my own bread, which I had brought from home in the morning, under my arm, wrapped up in a piece of paper like a book, and going into the best dining-room in Johnson's Alamode Beef-house in Clare Court, Drury Lane, and magnificently ordering a small plate of Alamode beef to eat with it. What the waiter thought of such a strange little apparition coming in all alone I don't know, but I can see him now, staring at me as I ate my dinner, and bringing up the other waiter to look. I gave him a halfpenny, and I wish now that he hadn't taken it." For the boy individually the prospect seemed to be growing drearier and drearier. This phrase indeed hardly expresses the fact, for, as he felt it, it was not so much a run of worsening luck, as the closing in of a certain and quiet calamity, like the coming on of twilight and dark. He felt that he would die and be buried in blacking. Through all this he does not seem to have said much to his parents of his distress. They who were in prison had certainly a much jollier time than he who was free. But of all the strange ways in which the human being proves that he is not a rational being, whatever else he is, no case is so mysterious and unaccountable as the secrecy of childhood. We learn of the cruelty of some school or child factory from journalists. We learn it from inspectors. We learn it from doctors. We learn it even from shame-stricken schoolmasters and repentant sweaters. But we never learn it from the children. We never learn it from the victims. It would seem as if a living creature had to be taught, like an art of culture, the art of crying out when it is heard. It would seem as if patience were the natural thing. It would seem as if impatience were an accomplishment like whist. However this may be, it is wholly certain that Dickens might have drudged and died drudging, and buried the unborn Pickwick, but for an external accident. He was, as has been said, in the habit of visiting his father at the Marshalsea every week. The talks between the two must have been a comedy at once more cruel and more delicate than Dickens ever described. Meredith might picture the comparison between the child whose troubles were so childish, but who felt them like a damned spirit, and the middle-aged man whose trouble was final ruin, and who felt it no more than a baby. Once, it would appear, the boy broke down altogether, perhaps under the unbearable buoyancy of his oratorical papa, and implored to be freed from the factory, implored it, I fear, with a precocious and almost horrible eloquence. The old optimist was astounded, too much astounded to do anything in particular. Whether the incident had really anything to do with what followed cannot be decided, but ostensibly it had not. Ostensibly the cause of Charles's ultimate liberation was a quarrel between his father and Lammert, the head of the factory. Dickens the elder, who had at last left the Marshalsea, could, no doubt, conduct a quarrel with the magnificence of a Micawber. The result of this talent, at any rate, was to leave Mr. Lammert in a towering rage. He had a stormy interview with Charles, in which he tried to be good-tempered to the boy, but could hardly master his tongue about the boy's father. Finally he told him he must go, and with every observance the little creature was solemnly expelled from hell. His mother, with a touch of strange harshness, was for patching up the quarrel and sending him back. Perhaps, with the fierce feminine responsibility, she felt that the first necessity was to keep the family out of debt. But old John Dickens put his foot down here, put his foot down with that ringing but very rare decision with which, once in 10 years, and often on some trivial matter, the weakest man will overwhelm the strongest woman. The boy was miserable, the boy was clever, the boy should go to school. The boy went to school. He went to the Wellington House Academy, Mornington Place. It was an odd experience for anyone to go from the world to a school instead of going from school to the world. Dickens, we may say, had his boyhood after his youth. He had seen life at its coarsest before he began his training for it, and knew the worst words in the English language probably before the best. This odd chronology, it will be remembered, he retained in his semi-autobiographical account of the adventures of David Copperfield, who went into the business of Murdstone and Grimby's before he went to the school kept by Dr. Strong. David Copperfield also went to be carefully prepared for a world that he had seen already. Outside David Copperfield, the records of Dickens at this time reduced themselves to a few glimpses provided by accidental companions of his school days, and little can be deduced from them about his personality beyond a general impression of sharpness and perhaps of bravado, of bright eyes and bright speeches. Probably the young creature was recuperating himself for his misfortunes, was making the most of his liberty, was flapping the wings of that wild spirit that had just not been broken. We hear of things that sound suddenly juvenile after his maturer troubles, of a secret language sounding like mere gibberish, and of a small theatre with paint and red fire, such as that which Stevenson loved. It was not an accident that Dickens and Stevenson loved it. It is a stage unsuited for psychological realism. The cardboard characters cannot analyse each other with any effect. But it is a stage almost divinely suited for making surroundings, for making that situation and background which belongs peculiarly to romance. A toy theatre, in fact, is the opposite of private theatricals. In the latter you can do anything with the people if you do not ask much from the scenery. In the former you can do anything in scenery if you do not ask much from the people. In a toy theatre you could hardly manage a modern dialogue on marriage, but the Day of Judgment would be quite easy. After leaving school, Dickens found employment as a clerk to Mr. Blackmore, a solicitor, as one of those inconspicuous underclerks whom he afterwards turned to many grotesque uses. Here no doubt he met Loughton and Swiveller, Chuckster and Wobbler, in so far as such sacred creatures ever had embodiments on this lower earth. But it is typical of him that he had no fancy at all to remain a solicitor's clerk. The resolution to rise which had glowed in him even as a dawdling boy when he gazed at Gad's Hill, which had been darkened but not quite destroyed by his fall into the factory routine, which had been released again by his return to normal boyhood and the boundaries of school, was not likely to content itself now with the copying out of agreements. He set to work, without any advice or help, to learn to be a reporter. He worked all day at law and all night at shorthand. It is an art which can only be effected by time, and he had to effect it by overtime. But learning the thing under every disadvantage, without a teacher, without the possibility of concentration or complete mental force, without ordinary human sleep, he made himself one of the most rapid reporters then alive. There is a curious contrast between the casualness of the mental training to which his parents and others subjected him, and the savage seriousness of the training to which he subjected himself. Somebody once asked old John Dickens where his son Charles was educated. "Well, really," said the great creature, in a spacious way, "he may be said to have educated himself." He might indeed. This practical intensity of Dickens is worth our dwelling on, because it illustrates an elementary antithesis in his character, or what appears as an antithesis in our modern popular psychology. We are always talking about strong men against weak men, but Dickens was not only both a weak man and a strong man, he was a very weak man and also a very strong man. He was everything that we currently call a weak man. He was a man hung on wires. He was a man who might at any moment cry like a child. He was so sensitive to criticism that one may say that he lacked a skin. He was so nervous that he allowed great tragedies in his life to arise only out of nerves. But in the matter where all ordinary strong men are miserably weak, in the matter of concentrated toil and clear purpose and unconquerable worldly courage, he was like a straight sword. Mrs. Carlyle, who in her human epithets often hit the right nail so that it rang, said of him once, "He has a face made of steel." This was probably felt in a flash when she saw, in some social crowd, the clear, eager face of Dickens cutting through those near him like a knife. Any people who had met him from year to year would each year have found a man weakly troubled about his worldly decline, and each year they would have found him higher up in the world. His was a character very hard for any man of slow and placable temperament to understand. He was the character whom anybody can hurt and nobody can kill. When he began to report in the House of Commons he was still only 19. His father, who had been released from his prison a short time before Charles had been released from his, had also become, among many other things, a reporter. But old John Dickens could enjoy doing anything without any particular aspiration after doing it well. But Charles was of a very different temper. He was, as I have said, consumed with an enduring and almost angry thirst to excel. He learned shorthand with a dark self-devotion as if it were a sacred hieroglyph. Of this self-instruction, as of everything else, he has left humorous and illuminating phrases. He describes how, after he had learned the whole exact alphabet, quote, "there then appeared a procession of new horrors, called arbitrary characters, the most despotic characters I have ever known, who insisted, for instance, that a thing like the beginning of a cobweb meant expectation, and that a pen and ink sky-rocket stood for disadvantageous." End quote. He concludes, "It was almost heart-breaking." But it is significant that somebody else, a colleague of his, concluded, "There never was such a shorthand writer." Dickens succeeded in becoming a shorthand writer, succeeded in becoming a reporter, succeeded ultimately in becoming a highly effective journalist. He was appointed as a reporter of the speeches in Parliament, first by the True Sun, then by the Mirror of Parliament, and last by the Morning Chronicle. He reported the speeches very well, and, if we must analyse his internal opinions, much better than they deserved. For it must be remembered that this lad went into the reporters' gallery full of the triumphant radicalism which was then the rising tide of the world. He was, it must be confessed, very little overpowered by the dignity of the Mother of Parliaments. He regarded the House of Commons much as he regarded the House of Lords, as a sort of venerable joke. It was perhaps while he watched, pale with weariness from the reporters' gallery, that there sank into him a thing that never left him, his unfathomable contempt for the British Constitution. Then perhaps he heard from the Government benches the immortal apologies of the Circumlocution Office. "Then would the noble lord or right honourable gentleman, in whose department it was to defend the Circumlocution Office, put an orange in his pocket and make a regular field day of the occasion. Then would he come down to that house with a slap upon the table and meet the honourable gentleman foot to foot. Then would he be there to tell that honourable gentleman that the Circumlocution Office was not only blameless in this matter, but was commendable in this matter, was extollable to the skies in this matter. Then would he be there to tell that honourable gentleman that although the Circumlocution Office was invariably right and wholly right, it never was so right in this matter. Then would he be there to tell the honourable gentleman that it would have been more to his honour, more to his credit, more to his good taste, more to his good sense, more to half the dictionary of commonplaces, if he had left the Circumlocution Office alone and never approached this matter. Then would he keep one eye upon a coach or crammer from the Circumlocution Office below the bar, and smash the honourable gentleman with the Circumlocution Office account of this matter. And although one of two things always happened, namely, either that the Circumlocution Office had nothing to say, and said nothing, or that it had something to say, of which the noble lord or right honourable gentleman blundered one half and forgot the other. The Circumlocution Office was always voted immaculate by an accommodating majority." We are now generally told that Dickens has destroyed these abuses, and that this is no longer a true picture of public life. Such, at any rate, is the Circumlocution Office account of this matter. But Dickens as a good radical would, I fancy, much prefer that we should continue his battle than that we should celebrate his triumph, especially when it has not come. England is still ruled by the great Barnacle family. Parliament is still ruled by the great Barnacle Trinity, the solemn old Barnacle who knew that the Circumlocution Office was protection, the sprightly young Barnacle who knew that it was a fraud, and the bewildered young Barnacle who knew nothing about it. From these three types our cabinets are still exclusively recruited. People talk of the tyrannies and anomalies which Dickens denounced as things of the past, like the Star Chamber. They believe that the days of the old stupid optimism and the old brutal indifference are gone forever. In truth, this very belief is only the countenance of the old stupid optimism and the old brutal indifference. We believe in a free England and a pure England, because we still believe in the Circumlocution Office account of this matter. Undoubtedly our serenity is widespread. We believe that England is really reformed. We believe that England is really democratic. We believe that English politics are free from corruption. But this general satisfaction of ours does not show that Dickens has beaten the Barnacles. It only shows that the Barnacles have beaten Dickens. It cannot be too often said, then, that we must read into young Dickens and his works this old radical tone towards institutions. That tone was a sort of happy impatience, and when Dickens had to listen for hours to the speech of the noble lord in defence of the Circumlocution Office, when, that is, he had to listen to what he regarded as the last vapourings of a vanishing oligarchy, the impatience rather predominated over the happiness. His incurably restless nature found more pleasure in the wandering side of journalism. He went about wildly in post-chaises to report political meetings for the Morning Chronicle. And what gentlemen they were to serve, he exclaimed, in such things at the old Morning Chronicle, great or small it did not matter. I've had to charge for half a dozen breakdowns in half a dozen times as many miles. I've had to charge for the damage of a great coat from the drippings of a blazing wax candle in riding through the smallest hours of the night in a swift flying carriage and pair." And again, "I have often transcribed for the printer from my shorthand notes important public speeches in which the strictest accuracy was required, and a mistake in which would have been to a young man severely compromising. writing on the palm of my hand, by the light of a dark lantern, in a post-chaise and four, galloping through a wild country and through the dead of the night, at the then surprising rate of 15 miles an hour." The whole of Dickens's life goes with the throb of that nocturnal gallop. All its real wildness shot through with an imaginative wickedness he afterwards uttered in the drive of Jonas Chuzzlewit through the storm. All this time, and indeed from a time of which no measure can be taken, the creative part of his mind had been in a stir, or even a fever. While still a small boy, he had written for his own amusement some sketches of queer people he had met, notably one of his uncle's barber, whose principal hobby was pointing out what Napoleon ought to have done in the matter of military tactics. He had a notebook full of such sketches. He had sketches not only of persons but of places, which were to him almost more personal than persons. In the December of 1833 he published one of these fragments in the Old Monthly Magazine. This was followed by 9 others in the same paper, and when the paper, which was a romantically radical venture, run by a veteran soldier of Bolivar, itself collapsed, Dickens continued the series in the Evening Chronicle, an offshoot of the morning paper of the same name. These were the pieces afterwards published and known as the Sketches by Boz, and with them Dickens enters literature. He also enters upon many things about this time. He enters manhood, and among other things marriage. A friend of his on the Chronicle, George Hogarth, had several daughters. With all of them Dickens appears to have been on terms of great affection. This sketch is wholly literary, and I do not feel it necessary to do more than touch upon such incidents as his marriage, just as I shall do no more than touch upon the tragedy that ultimately overtook it. But it may be suggested here that the final misfortunes were in some degree due to the circumstances attending the original action. A very young man fighting his way, and excessively poor, with no memories for years past that were not monotonous and mean, and with his strongest and most personal memories quite ignominious and unendurable, was suddenly thrown into the society of a whole family of girls. I think it does not overstate his weakness, and I think it partly constitutes his excuse, to say that he fell in love with the chance of love. As sometimes happens in the undeveloped youth, an abstract femininity simply intoxicated him. In what came afterwards, he was enormously to blame. But I do not think that his was a case of cold division from a woman whom he had once seriously and singly loved. He had been bewildered in a burning haze, I will not say even of first love, but of first flirtations. The whole family stimulated him before he fell in love with one of them, and it continued to stimulate him long after he had quarrelled with her for causes that did not even destroy his affection for her. This view is strikingly supported by all the details of his attitude towards all the other members of the sacred house of Hogarth. One of the sisters remained, of course, his dearest friend till death. Another, who had died, he worshipped like a saint, and he always asked to be buried in her grave. He was married on April 2nd, 1836. Forster remarks that a few days before the announcement of their marriage in the Times, the same paper contained another announcement, that on the 31st would be published the first number of a work called The Posthumous Papers of the Pickwick Club. It is the beginning of his career. The sketches, apart from splendid splashes of humour here and there, are not manifestations of the man of genius. We might almost say that this book is one of the few books by Dickens which would not, standing alone, have made his fame. And yet standing alone it did make his fame. His contemporaries could see a new spirit in it, where we, familiar with the larger fruits of that spirit, can only see a continuation of the prosaic and almost wooden wit of the comic books of that day. But, in any case, we should hardly look in that man's first book for the fullness of his contribution to letters. Youth is almost everything else, but it is hardly ever original. We read of young men bursting on the old world with a new message, but youth in actual experience is the period of imitation, and even of obedience. Subjectively, its emotions may be furious and headlong, but its only external outcome is a furious imitation and a headlong obedience. As we grow older we learn the special thing we have to do. As a man goes on towards the grave he discovers gradually a philosophy he can really call fresh, a style he can really call his own, and as he becomes an older man he becomes a new writer. Ibsen, in his youth, wrote almost classic plays about Vikings. It was in his old age that he began to break windows and throw fireworks. The only fault, it was said, of Browning's first poems was that they had too much beauty of imagery, and too little wealth of thought. The only fault, that is, of Browning's first poems was that they were not Browning's. In one way, however, the Sketches by Boz do stand out very symbolically in the life of Dickens. They constitute in a manner the dedication of him to his especial task, the sympathetic and yet exaggerated painting of the poorer middle class. He was to make men feel that this dull middle class was actually a kind of elf-land. But here again the work is rude and undeveloped, and this is shown in the fact that it is a great deal more exaggerative than it is sympathetic. We are not, of course, concerned with the kind of people who say that they wish that Dickens was more refined. If those people are ever refined, it will be by fire. But there is in this earliest work an element which almost vanished in the later ones, an element which is typical of the middle classes in England, and which is in a more real sense to be called vulgar. I mean that in these little farces there is a trace, in the author as well as in the characters, of that petty sense of social precedence, that hubbub of little unheard-of oligarchies, which is the only serious sin of bourgeoisie of Britain. It may seem pragmatical, for example, to instance such rowdy farce as the story of Horatio Sparkins, which tells how a tuft-hunting family entertained a rhetorical youth, thinking he was a lord, and found he was a draper's assistant. No doubt they were very snobbish in thinking that a lord must be eloquent, but we cannot help feeling that Dickens is almost equally snobbish in feeling it is so very funny that a draper's assistant should be eloquent. A free man, one would think, would despise the family quite as much if Horatio had been a peer. Here, and here only, there is just a touch of the vulgarity, of the only vulgarity of the world out of which Dickens came. For the only element of lowness that there really is in our populace is exactly that they are full of superiorities and very conscious of class. Shades, imperceptible to the eyes of others, but as hard and haughty as a Brahmin caste, separate one kind of charwoman from another kind of charwoman. Dickens was destined to show with inspired symbolism all the immense virtues of the democracy. He was to show them as the most humorous part of our civilization, which they certainly are. He was to show them as the most promptly and practically compassionate part of our civilization, which they certainly are. The democracy has 100 exuberant good qualities. The democracy has only one outstanding sin. It is not democratic. End of chapter 3.